Started. Good evening, everybody. My name is Shruti Bhatnagar, and I am the chair of the Sierra Club Montgomery County Group. Thank you all for joining our presentation on the Buildings Energy Performance Standards today. And we will introduce the panelists, but before that, I would like to acknowledge my Sierra Club colleague, Gary Young, who is from our administrative staff. Thank you, Gary, for helping set up the webinar and for being here to help us give tech support. Thanks so much. All right, and then I have Walter Weiss from MC Facts. Walter and I will be moderating the Q&A session. Hi, Walter, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Walter Weiss. I'm a member of the Sierra Club, but I'm here really as the representative of the Montgomery County Faith Alliance for Climate Solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. We also have with us our presenters, Adam Ortiz, who's the director of DEP and the Department of Environmental Protection team with us. So I would like to welcome all of you, and starting with Adam, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you so much, Shruti. First, I want to express my gratitude to everybody for having us and for bringing the spotlight on the super critical, urgently needed policy change. I'm the director of the department for 3 years, but in 1 week, I'll be transitioning to EPA Region 3. Well, I will not be in this role, but still be in a partnership role with all of you on this and many other issues. But it's great to be here and great to be part of this team. And I'm joined by Stan Edwards, Emily, and Lindsey, but I'll let them introduce themselves.
So Lindsey, and then you can pass it on to someone.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsey Shaw. I'm with the Department of Environmental Protection. Thanks, Adam, for joining us. Thank you for Sierra Club for having us this evening. We're excited to talk about BEPS. I manage energy and sustainability programs for DEP in Stan Edwards' division. So I'm going to turn it over to Stan.
Hi, I'm Stan Edwards. I'm the chief of the Division of Energy, Climate, and Compliance in DEP. And Emily is the next.
Yep, I'm Emily Curley, Commercial Energy Program Manager on Lindsey's team. So I manage our energy benchmarking law, and that's, as you'll learn if you don't already know, foundational policy to BEPS, and have been involved with the policy crafting and analysis around that. So nice to see everyone, and thanks for having us.
Well, thank you. And so I think everybody on the call is probably already aware of this, but just to give a little bit of background here on what is BEPS, and I'm often reminded that we should always make sure that we be very clear when we use these terms that not everybody might be aware of. So BEPS is the Buildings Energy Performance Standards that are policies that establish performance levels for buildings and drive all buildings that BEPS covers to achieve these levels in the long term with required progress at regular intervals in the interim. The BEPS legislation was introduced earlier in 2021 April, and so we have a team here from the Environmental Protection team, and they are going to share a presentation today, following which we will have question and answers from our audience. So we do have, you can put your questions in the Q&A box for the panelists, and we will come back to that after we have seen the presentation. So without further ado, I want to pass it on to Lindsey.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that. I'm going to share my screen. Hope you all can see that. If someone can give me a thumbs up, appreciate it. Cool, thank you. So again, we're here to talk about the Building Energy Performance Standard proposal that's in front of the County Council right now. Appreciate the opportunity to brief all of you today about this. So how do we get to BEPS? We all know, I think that everyone on this call is familiar with the County Council passing the Climate Emergency Declaration back in December of 2017, declaring a climate emergency in Montgomery County. That accelerated our greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. So our goals currently are an 80% reduction by 2027 and a complete elimination of greenhouse gas emissions by 2035. You can see our past performance here with our 2005 baseline. We've had a 19% reduction since then. So pretty good progress so far. But as you can see by the 2 stars on the chart, we have a long way to go. We've done our GHG emissions inventory with the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. They do our emissions inventory every 2 to 3 years. And so the most recent year of data that we have is the calendar year of 2018. We should have the calendar year 2020 by the end of this year, early next year. I think I have that right. So if you're looking at this pie chart here, you'll see that residential and commercial buildings, the energy used in our built environment makes up approximately 50% of the GHG emissions in our community-wide emissions inventory. So when we're talking about building energy performance standards, we're saying that about a portion of the residential building slice and a portion of the commercial building slice, those existing buildings will need to improve their performance through energy efficiency measures. And otherwise, if they're not meeting it through building code, if they're not coming to the county for building code, those buildings have no reason to improve their energy performance by getting up to current building code. So this requires buildings that aren't necessarily doing energy reductions to come up and meet that minimum energy performance standard. So when I talk about BEPS or BEPS, Building Energy Performance Standard, I'm also talking about Bill 1621. The approach for this is we've had a foundational benchmarking policy in Montgomery County since May of 2014. So we have a number of years of benchmarking data that we're building on top of. So we said, why don't we enhance the current benchmarking law as opposed to adding a new piece of legislation? Still new legislation, but we're amending an existing policy. So we're modifying the benchmarking law to both expand the number of buildings that are covered by benchmarking requirements, adding in a performance requirement, and then we're also establishing a brand new advisory board to advise the county on how to implement BEPS in Montgomery County. And I mentioned earlier, why are we doing this? Why are we looking at existing buildings? Building code doesn't cover all buildings. Unless you are required to go to permitting services, no one necessarily needs to improve the performance of their building to current code. So building energy performance standards is one of those really powerful policy tools that is able to drive energy performance and those GHG emission reductions that we really need to meet our climate action goals here from the existing built environment. So when we got together and started to put pen to paper on this legislation, we followed the example of other jurisdictions before us. We said, okay, let's signal to the market that we want to do a building performance standard. We want to say, this is what we're thinking of doing. Here are the parameters, the framework in which we want to do this. And then we'll come back later with technical details through regulation. That's how DC did it with their rulemaking process, how St. Louis did it with their process. So we're following the kind of best practice of other jurisdictions that have done BEPS before us. By doing it this way, by modifying the existing benchmarking law, there's some kind of technical legislative footwork going on here. The cities of Rockville and Gaithersburg, where a number of commercial buildings already exist in Montgomery County, they have already opted into the benchmarking law. So they don't have to go through the process of opting into yet another piece of legislation that the counties put out. They can continue to be opted in. They can opt out if they want to, but they don't have to do anything additional to stay opted into the benchmarking and performance law. We got stakeholder voices together. Some folks on the phone were involved in that conversation. We have the link here in the slides, which Shruti has a copy of. That takes you to our stakeholder report. We got together some key stakeholders. We, of course, met about a month and a half before the pandemic started and continued to meet virtually through the pandemic. But those stakeholders were really important in providing that feedback to say, hey, what works in Washington, D.C. is not going to work here. Let's think about a policy that's going to be appropriate for the very unique building stock that we have in Montgomery County. The key takeaway of that stakeholder process was to balance flexibility and certainty for building owners. Give us options on how we can meet the performance standard, but give us certainty of where you want us to get to in a long range way. We understand that you have these climate goals. We want to help you meet them, but you need to give us the opportunity to operate our buildings how we operate them while also keeping energy efficiency in mind. So I just want to touch very briefly on the benchmarking law. Emily mentioned it earlier. I also brought it up in May of 2014. We passed an energy benchmarking law. It's pretty innovative at the time. There are still jurisdictions that don't even have a benchmarking law in the book. So how lucky are we in Montgomery County that we have such a great foundation to start on? So this requires the county buildings and privately owned non-residential commercial buildings, 50,000 square feet and greater, to benchmark their energy use and portfolio manager, verify that data the first year and every third year thereafter, which means that we are getting good quality data when it's reported to the county every year. That benchmarking deadline is June 1st. If anyone on this call happens to have questions about the benchmarking law, please contact Emily Curley. She is our benchmarking guru. She knows everything about benchmarking, and make sure that the county is the highest compliance rate we've ever had under this law. So kudos to Emily. But what this really means is it's great for us that we have a high compliance rate. It's better for building owners. They have the information at hand to make really good decisions about how to improve their buildings based on the energy use that benchmarking data tells them. But again, foundational to having a BEPS. We could have passed benchmarking at BEPS at the same time. Wasn't really a thing back then. There are jurisdictions now that are doing both. Commend them. But we really have a good foundation and good quality data to start a benchmarking policy. So when we're talking about amendments, I mentioned earlier that we are expanding the number of buildings that will have to comply with the benchmarking law, and then will eventually have to comply with a performance standard. So right now, approximately 40% of the commercial floor area in Montgomery County is covered by the benchmarking law. The amendments in front of council right now expand that to 85%. So that is a significant amount of energy, primarily by the addition of multifamily buildings under the law's coverage. Just a quick snapshot. I'm not going to talk through this line by line. There are a number of jurisdictions that have started to adopt BEPS policies across the country. There's a very small handful of them. There is no silver bullet. No one has figured out the right way to do this yet. We're all moving forward in the way that we think is best for our jurisdictions. Washington, D.C. has a pretty uniform building stock such that Energy Star scores work really well for them. Doesn't work so well in Montgomery County. We have a very unique building stock, and not all building types can earn the Energy Star score. So we selected site EUI as our metric, similar to St. Louis and Washington State. New York City selected a greenhouse gas emissions metric base. Pretty complicated to implement. They have a lot of staff to also help them implement that. We didn't feel like it was a great fit for Montgomery County. Variety and who's covered, variety and compliance cycles. The one takeaway here is that Montgomery County has what is called the trajectory model. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. But this is the model that the Institute for Market Transformation is putting in their model ordinance for other jurisdictions to adopt moving forward. So that was test bed in Montgomery County and grown out of Montgomery County based on input from our stakeholders. So we're particularly proud of that. So let's say advisory board. Not everyone has an advisory board. Some do, and their powers differ here and there. We have our advisory board advising the county. We're the ultimate decision-making authority. So in terms of this trajectory model, this is pretty cool. This is a long-term standard. It gives the regulated community time to understand what BEPS is. It gives us time to educate them. This is a long-term target in the future. It balances that climate emergency need with the immediate action that building owners, they also need that certainty moving forward. We don't want to move the goalposts on them every couple of years. We want them to work towards a long-range standard. Every building gets their own custom baseline based on their actual past performance. So we have an averaged historical energy use baseline. Same thing as a benchmarking law. Those buildings are going to report their data through portfolio manager, already required by the benchmarking law. They're not doing additional paperwork. That was a big thing that our stakeholders said, don't make it more difficult for us to comply with this. Every 4 years, building owners are going to have an evaluation of their interim standard to say, how well am I doing towards that final target? So that'll be determined. That final target, of course, is not set quite yet. We're planning on coming back with regulation once we understand the parameters in which county executive and county council are comfortable, how aggressive they want that standard to be. But we want to make sure that we get the policy part right with the guidance for the industry to make sure that we're moving in the right direction, with those finer details coming through regulation later. We're also looking into what a credit might look like for on-site solar. This is something really important to the county executive to use this policy to incentivize on-site solar installations. So we're undertaking some additional research to provide us with some recommendations about that. We understand that building owners don't operate their buildings in this nice, smooth, straight line in terms of energy reductions. The orange line here is likely what we would see in terms of energy reductions. Tenant turnover, empower incentives coming available, recapitalization cycles happening for other buildings. Buildings might have a bumpier trajectory down to the final standard. So at this first interim standard, this building A actual performance isn't meeting their target. So we do have a compliance path in the law for them. It's called the Building Performance Improvement Plan. That includes documenting why they can't meet the standard, why it's not economically feasible for them to do so. A list of measures and the energy savings cost benefit analysis of those, a timeline for achieving the standards, and then procedures for correcting any non-compliance with the plan that they file. The plan gets approved by the county. If we need additional input, we'll go to this advisory board, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then that gets filed on the, it's filed as a covenant on the county land record. So it does have a pretty binding, strong force associated with the building performance improvement plan. So I just wanted to step back for a second. We've talked about two different ways building owners can comply. Not all buildings are going to start at the same point. We have a couple different building scenarios here. Say these are office buildings. We've got a couple different ways that these buildings are starting out. So if you look at the very bottom of this chart, this green line here is an example building, a building that's below the target. So what they need to do, they just need to maintain their good performance. They don't necessarily need to make additional effort to meet a final standard. The yellow line here, they're already doing pretty well compared to the final standard. They just have a little bit of energy they need to eke out of their building. Perhaps some improved operations and maintenance, perhaps some retro commissioning would get them to the standard. Minimal investment needed there. The other two lines here, the blue line is the same line as we saw before. They need to make some investment to meet their target, but there's some capital available and the owner reaps the long-term benefit overall with better operations of their building. So they're going to meet their final standard. But this purple line up top, they're just not going to make it. They've tried everything they can. They can't keep their tenants from cranking up the air conditioning and opening their windows at the same time. There's one very expensive project that they're just not going to be able to undertake. They don't have multi-million dollars of capital at their disposal. They're going to raise up their hand and say, I need to file a building performance improvement plan. I cannot meet the standard. They're going to tell us what they can do. They can reduce their energy a little bit, but they're not going to be able to meet their standard. But if they file a BEPS and they commit to doing what they say they'll do, they'll be considered in compliance with the law. I talked briefly about the Building Advisory Board earlier. This, again, would make recommendations on BEPS implementation, but the county is the ultimate decision-making authority. There's 15 voting members serving 2 3-year terms. This is very similar to the boards, committees, and commissions structure that's already existing in the government. They're tasked with advising on reviewing those BPIPs if we have questions, changes in ownership, changes in building use, what to do with campuses. Buildings don't fit in a nice, neat box, so we really need this advisory board to advise us on how BEPS applies to unique situations, which is why we have a variety of membership on here. County leadership, building owners, the affected community, the utilities, energy and engineering services, finance, folks who are used to financing things in the commercial and multifamily space, nonprofits, and industry representatives. We want to make sure that we have a lot of voices in the room. We understand not everyone's going to agree, but we want to make sure that we hear from a variety of voices when we're implementing this law moving forward. Once Bill 1621 is passed, we'll be able to start putting this advisory board together. We've, of course, had a lot of conversations and feedback about this policy about how to make sure that equity is at the forefront of our minds. That was a pillar of our climate action plan, and we have equity enhancing measures in the BEPS action of that report. We've heard, what about affordable housing? We already have an affordable housing crisis here. This is going to make it worse. We went into this with the policy decision that affordable housing should be covered. Affordable housing tenants should have the same better indoor air quality, high performing building that market rate tenants do, that they shouldn't get any, they shouldn't be less than. We understand that that comes with responsibility on the county's part to come forward with technical and financial assistance for those buildings. There's naturally occurring or unregulated affordable housing in Montgomery County, buildings that just naturally command a lower rent. We want to make sure that those tenants are not displaced. We understand that there are split incentives with landlords and tenants. Who pays the utility bill? What to do with pass-through costs? That is a challenge that we have heard, we recognize. We want to make sure that we don't exacerbate any existing challenges with that. And we've also heard that you're going after large carbon emitters, but unfortunately, that's also multifamily buildings where potentially low and moderate income customers reside. There's an equity implication there. Why aren't you also going after single family homeowners and the emissions from their structures? We'll get to them. Don't worry. We want to make sure we get BEPS right first. For these under-resourced sectors, we've built in some flexibility there. In the law, it states that there's adjustments or extensions can be provided for affordable housing, houses of worship, small businesses, and nonprofit building owners. So what that actually means will be defined in regulation, and we'd love to continue the conversation on what that means for Sierra Club's membership and others in the county. But we want to make sure that we at least had that flexibility to start with, that we had the authority to give that flexibility. We, of course, have affordable housing and racial equity, social justice, and climate nonprofit representation on the advisory board. And then when we're assessing penalties and reviewing those building performance improvement plans, that we have equity in mind when we're reviewing those. Mentioned before, mentioned again, I'll continue to mention that this law requires financial and technical assistance. There are a bunch of programs out there already, and we're going to talk about them. But to navigate all those as a small building owner with potentially a million other needs, we realize that there needs to be an easier way to access those resources. So we are exploring what a one-stop shop model can look like for Montgomery County, and making sure that we have that in place before multifamily properties, which get phased in to the law, before they have to comply with this law. So we want to make sure we have that in place. We don't have it in place right now. We're hoping soon we will, and definitely before multifamily buildings need to comply with the performance standard. So I've mentioned regulation a couple times. What does that mean? First, filing legislation. Regulation it has the same similar pathway to legislation, but it's a companion piece to the existing legislation. It puts a finer point on some of those details. Some of those things include the actual building groupings, office buildings, multifamily buildings, establishing what the building groupings are going to be and what their numerical standards are going to be. What do they have to work towards? What's that on-site solar generation credit going to look like? What are you actually going to make building owners do for building performance improvement plans? What does economic and feasibility actually mean? Who gets to file one of these BEPS? And then what does that adjustment or assistance look like for under-resourced sectors? So the current bill, which has been delayed longer than we would have liked it to be delayed, originally had the regulations due to council June 1st of 2022. I have a sense that will be pushed back. Don't have a crystal ball, but I'm just guessing that might be pushed back. But Bill 1621 has that written as June 1st of 2022. So looking at this timeline, the first buildings that would have to be, that newly covered buildings that would have to benchmark and then have 3 years worth of benchmarking data and then come into the performance standard, that's group 3. They would need to start benching their 2021 data by June 1st of 2022. That's technically possible with the aggregated utility data that our local utilities make available. They keep up to 24 months of historical data. That's great, but these building owners have not known about it. It is currently October 21st of that year. So the building owners will have six-ish weeks to really get their stuff together. Doesn't seem like seems like a crunch timeline. So again, those newly covered buildings will have 3 years of benchmarking. I will say from experience, and I don't want to speak for Emily, but I'm sure I can, benchmarking is not easy for everybody. It does take a significant amount of work, especially if you are an under-resourced building that doesn't have an on-site facilities person who understands what an energy bill looks like. It's not easy for some folks. We want to make sure that we give them the assistance and the tools they need to benchmark properly, and give them a couple years of doing it before we expect them to reduce their energy use. So that's what this phase timeline, that's the big takeaway here, that folks have enough education on benchmarking and energy performance before they enter into the BEPS program, and then they have their long-term standard to meet 12 to 15 years out into the future. Oop, okay, sorry, I thought I skipped one. So just summing up everything we've talked about, again, Bill 1621 is the catchy name for BEPS. Oops. It's the more official name for BEPS. This is the first key piece of major climate legislation coming from the county executive about following the release of the climate action plan. We developed this with stakeholder input. You can see the report on the BEPS webpage. This sets long-term performance standards based on energy within the building owner's control. So we have heard from some stakeholders that, why aren't you using a GHG metric? If you use a GHG metric, that has a bigger implications than what a building owner can directly control on their site. Site EUI, energy use intensity, is the energy used at the site. It's something facility managers can understand. It's something that is easily communicated out to the public rather than the calculations involved in getting a GHG standard. So simplicity was key here for some of the stakeholders in our group. Again, BEPS will cover the largest buildings and the biggest carbon emitters in Montgomery County. And in the end, there's a number of co-benefits associated with BEPS, including more resilient, higher value buildings, increased economic activity, and local green jobs in Montgomery County based on the building upgrades that are going to need to be done to some of these buildings. And then when you're talking about tenants, you're having better indoor air quality because electrification is an indirect way that you can meet BEPS. So all of those things are happening in addition to lowering our greenhouse gas emissions. I mentioned earlier, there are a variety of tools that already exist to help building owners reduce their energy use. I'm going to talk about them in about 2 slides, so I'm not going to read this list here, but we understand that even though there's programs and support out there, building owners still need some help to figure out what it all means, what it means for their building, and how to pay for some of this stuff. But if we can actually get Bill 1621 passed, which we absolutely need to do for any of our climate plan to have an effect, we will still be the first county in the country, fingers crossed, to join this leading edge group of jurisdictions that have passed a building energy performance standard. St. Louis, Washington, DC, New York City, they're not just the big heavy hitters. Smaller groups are doing this too. So I think that we can do it. So next steps. Shruti mentioned that in April, we transmitted this law over to council. They formally introduced it onto their agenda on May 4th. They held their public hearing on July 20th. And our first committee work session is next week. It is October 28th at 9:30 a.m. So turn on your TiVos, those still exist. You can go to the YouTube page for the council hearings. You can watch it there. And then we do expect additional work sessions after the first one before it goes to final votes in front of the full council. We have continued to do outreach to stakeholders, climate advocates, building owners, you name it, we'll talk to them. And we're also developing a number of training materials to help building owners understand what this means for their building. We're finalizing the data analysis that will help inform the regulations that will follow Bill 1621. That should be available in fall of 2021. We're hoping to release that report relatively soon. Hoping that when Bill 1621 is passed, we'll start putting the advisory board together. So if anyone's interested here in joining the advisory board, please send us an email. We want to make sure that we explore what building owner assistance looks like. Where do people need help? We know there's a bunch of programs out there, but they might not be perfect. So we want to hear from building owners, want to hear from tenants, what's going to be functional for them. And of course, with the data analysis that we're doing, we are working on drafting those regulations. So we give this briefing, people say, okay, what can I do? The first thing that you can do is talk about BEPS with other organizations and start normalizing that this, while it's cutting edge, there are other jurisdictions doing this. We are not an oddball here. We really need to do this if we're serious about our climate emergency goals here. Stay engaged with us while we're drafting regulations. We're happy to come back to this group and give updates on what we're doing and how well we're doing. Again, anyone interested in the advisory board, give us a holler. And then if you know someone who has a building in Montgomery County, start talking to them about all the opportunities that are out there. We would be happy to talk to them directly just to help them navigate all these programs. But also the Montgomery County Green Bank would be happy to talk to them too and navigate both the incentive programs, how to find a contractor, how to get an energy audit done, how to explore tax incentives, and then of course, whatever needs covering left over, the Green Bank is there to help folks with flexible financing for clean energy and energy efficiency projects. So with that, I'm done with my briefing. Here's our contact information. We're happy to talk about BEPS all day, every day. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see all of you. And I see that the Q&A and the chat's been busy while I've been talking. So catch up on that.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, for your presentation. And yes, we will get to Q&As. But before we get to that, I do want to mention that Sierra Club has supported the BEPS legislation. It's expected to produce many consequent benefits that the Sierra Club supports, including increased energy efficiency, resiliency, and sustainability of new and existing buildings, reduced energy consumption and air pollution, and improved human health because of better indoor and outdoor air quality, as you mentioned earlier. We also support creating more green jobs that come from construction and retrofit of buildings to increase their energy efficiency and resiliency that result in increased economic activity. And I wanted to share this because it's important for us, for everyone to know on the call that Sierra Club is committed to fighting climate change, but also reaching 100% clean energy goals for our county. So with that, we will open the Q&As. And one of the questions that I will take from the chat is from Yvonne, who is actually our energy lead on our team. Does utility representation include gas utilities and electric utilities? How many of each? I'm slightly concerned that electrification measures to improve efficiency will be swayed by gas utilities vote on the advisory board.
So we don't have a carve out for any number of utilities. We just say that if you read the legislation, that there's a list of organizations that should be represented, should, not must. That's an important legal term. If we have no utilities volunteering to be on the board, we don't have to fill the spot. If we have a natural gas and electric utility raising their hand to participate, we will take both of them. Or we won't. I mean, it depends on their application. You came off mute, Stan. You want to say something?
Oh, no. Well, when you're done, I just want to
Okay.
say, I mean, I think it's good to have them in the conversation. They're part of the solution here.
All right, thank you. Well, I will pass it on to Walter. Walter, did you want to jump in? You're on mute.
Yes, okay. We have a second question from Brian. It says climate change is already happening. Waiting all those years before the new standards would need to be followed is unacceptable. Couldn't there be tax benefits available for buildings that meet the BEPS sooner than required?
Sure, I think that's a nice suggestion. We already have tax incentives available. The council recently passed in September of last year, Bill 1020 was recently amended with emergency legislation because we found some logistical problems with the implementation. Bill 3121, these provide energy efficiency tax incentives to both new construction and existing buildings that show demonstrated energy improvements. Either they're for new construction, which doesn't start until next year, January 1 of 2022, new construction buildings that exceed code by a minimum of 10% in their energy performance with a demonstrated energy model. We're hoping to incentivize more net zero energy buildings in Montgomery County. We are incentivizing energy efficiency first. If buildings decide to also get a green label, green certification like LEED, BREEAM, some of the other ones, NGBS, the other ILFI, the Living Futures Institute. There are other building certifications beyond LEED that are recognized in this program, but it's energy efficiency first. We want to make sure that you're having a building that's being built that is exceeding energy code and will always exceed code. As the code improves, the incentive will need to be higher, a higher bar to reach. For existing buildings, if you take your Energy Star 12-month performance data you do an energy conservation project, and then you have another 12 months of demonstrated improved energy performance, you can get a tax credit for that. It is a generous tax credit. The new construction program has no cap. The existing building programs has $5 million of a cap available per year, per levy year. So it's a pretty significant tax credit. It's brand new. As far as we know, it's one of the first in the country that has been structured this way. So we're particularly excited about that, opening our doors up for that. The legislation was passed earlier this month, so now we can finalize the forms that we've been working on for a year. That they're done. I'll also note that there was a late amendment to that legislation that allows buildings in equity enhancing areas, to receive an additional 10% tax credit. So if you meet the energy performance and you're in one of those areas, you get an additional 10% tax benefit. So we're excited for existing buildings to do that. We realized the old program that we had for incentivizing green buildings only incentivized LEED. It didn't necessarily state that energy performance was important. So this allows other buildings where say LEED certification is just too expensive for them. It allows them to participate in the program without necessarily earning that green building label. So I hope that answers the tax credit question. And I think that the tax credit question for early adopters, I'd say get on this tax credit. Once those forms open up, that is available for building owners to start improving their energy performance now. So I would say that it's not necessarily the BEPS tax incentive, but it's certainly close.
Thank you, Lindsay. And then we have a question from Dave Sears. Do you expect that funds may be available from Biden's Build Back Better program to help support MOCO's building energy improvements?
I think that's an excellent question. I would love for funds to be available from this Build Back Better program. I have yet to hear that the BEPS program has been blessed with such funding, but we certainly hope that there's something coming our way. But as far as we know, we're not expecting anything.
All right, passing it on to you, Walter.
So I have a question, follow-up from Brian here. It says mitigation work group of the Maryland Commission on Climate Change has issued its building energy transition plan. A core recommendation is that building codes should require all new buildings to be all electric. Do you think that could be included in BEPS?
So by selecting the metric that we have of site energy use intensity, we are incentivizing it, essentially. We're encouraging electrification just based on that. So there are some energy systems that when you electrify, it will be more energy efficient than the current gas systems that maybe were installed 10 or 15 years ago. In some cases, gas can be more efficient, but in the long run, if we're thinking about efficiency of electric systems are improving, eventually if we're thinking about our GHG emissions, we want to make sure that things are electrified so that we can actually meet our GHG reduction goals here. But it looks like, I'm just reading this answered question here. In terms of electrifying new buildings, I will say that newly constructed buildings, the appropriate place to direct those requirements are in the building code. And we are looking to do that now. We are looking at the New Buildings Institute decarbonization code as a way forward in Montgomery County. Building codes in the state of Maryland are very cool if folks don't follow building code efforts. When the state adopts building code, local jurisdictions can be more aggressive, but not less aggressive than the state adopted code. So that means we can be more aggressive, we can be more stringent at the county level than at the state level. And we are 100% planning on doing that, such that we are making decisions in the building code that encourage electrification. We are on the path to requiring it for new construction, but for the 2021 code, which the state is currently considering now, They'll have to adopt by June of 2022. We have until June of 2023 to make our modifications and vote on them through council. So we are looking to use the building code to achieve our climate action plan objectives.
Thank you, Lindsay. And if I can just ask the DEP team if you want to add any comments. Stan, Emily, please go for it.
I just wanted to add something that I had typed an answer in there, and fortunately, Lindsay and I had similar answers, so that's good. You know, but one thing I wanted to point out that, you know, Brian said the work group recommended the state adopt a code, all electric code, and that would definitely help if the state adopts a code. You know, right now we're pushing out in front of the state, and that's always difficult because people say, well, you're doing it in Montgomery County, but what are they doing in Prince George's or Howard County or across the river in Virginia? But if the state adopts a statewide all electric code, well, then it's much easier because we don't have a choice. As Lindsay said, that's the floor. We can't go below that. So hopefully the state will follow through on that recommendation.
Well, and my personal comment to that would be, we believe we are leaders in Montgomery County, and we have to do what it takes to get to our goals. And so, yeah, people can join us and follow us, but we can't hold back because things aren't happening elsewhere.
And we're not. We're, as Lindsay said, we're pushing toward a zero energy code, but if the state does it, that helps.
Absolutely. Emily, would you like to add anything?
No, I think my teammates have it covered here.
Excellent. Well, there was a follow-up question from Yvonne. In what cases are gas more efficient? Genuinely curious to understand what those circumstances might be.
I might turn this over to our new CEM, Emily Curley.
Yeah, that's a good question. It definitely varies. I would say that electric resistance heating tends to be the least efficient form of electric heating. So in some cases, the gas system could be marginally better. Some of the studies we've seen, and I can drop that into the chat for you to review, but some of the studies we've seen from the EPA is that when you're looking at site energy use intensity, even inefficient electric resistance heating tends to look, again, slightly better than the most efficient gas system. So, you know, it can vary kind of case by case, but let me see if I can find that and I'll drop that in the chat for you to take a look at.
Thank you. So let me ask Walter, do you have another question? I would also like to ask Adam to take a few minutes to jump in when you're ready, Adam, to add anything to what's already been shared, but especially just talking a little bit more about how we can help move this forward. I know, Lindsay, you mentioned it's going to be at the T&E committee meeting, the work session on October 28th. And we would certainly encourage individuals to email the T&E committee members to move this forward. But would you like to add comments, Adam?
Yeah, thank you. You can tell that the team has put so much effort into designing this legislation. We've talked to peers, we've engaged stakeholders, and it's been a long time in the making, and we've had the benefit of the benchmarking law to learn from. So we have a great baseline, and the conditions could not be better for getting this policy in place. And the role of Montgomery County, in my opinion, has been to be the leader. We have to take the tough policies. We have to take the steps forward. Sometimes they're risky, but if we can't do it here, then it's going to be tougher for other counties to follow suit. So it's so important that we're successful getting this legislation passed this year. It's been a slow go. As some of us may be aware, we're entering election season where things can get a little bit funky, and politics sometimes are preferred over policy. But it's incumbent on the stakeholders, all of you who understand the importance of the policy, to make sure that the policy is predominant over any politics, and that we get this off the line. There's a lot of affected stakeholders. There's some uncertainty just because we don't have all the rules written yet, because we're still waiting on some very granular data on different building types and the cost and the return on investment on certain improvements over other improvements. And those are all things that we will figure out. But what's before the council now is to authorize the department to begin to promulgate those regulations, those rules, those standards. We can't do anything until council gives us the green light to start developing the rules. So there's a little bit of confusion in the debate. Hopefully it's just inside baseball, but some are going to push back saying, hey, we don't have enough detail yet. This is too much too fast. So I want to emphasize that the bill that's in front of the council a week from today, a week from this afternoon, or this morning rather, a week from this morning, is to give us the authority to create the rules and regulations. And those rules and regulations also go before council. They also have public hearing. They also have stakeholder input to find out, you know, what are the standards that should be for multifamily buildings? What should it be for hospitals? What should it be for office buildings? All that stuff we can get to that in the regulation, but we got to get going. And I can't underscore how important this is. This is probably the most important legislation the county's put forward on the environment in at least a decade, arguably many decades. 25% of emissions come from the commercial building sector. 50% come from the entire built sector, but we know we got to get the commercial right first, because there's thousands of commercial buildings, and we pretty much know what they are thanks to Emily and the benchmarking. So we can get to work on them. We can work with them, and we can work with the associations, etc. And we got to learn that. The residential stuff is tougher. There's hundreds of thousands of residents in the county. So we got to make sure that we get out of the gate, because we can make a difference on greenhouse gas emissions with this legislation. But per the comments earlier and the questions earlier, we must get going. So please reach out to the T&E committee members. That's Tom Hucker, he's the chair, Evan Glass, and Hans Reamer. Most of us know them personally. They've all privately expressed to me and the team support, but they're also getting a lot of pressure from corporations. They're also getting a lot of pressure from some of the chambers of commerce to consider slowing it down. And we have met with the chambers of commerce. We met with the apartment and building owners associations, and we have work groups with them. So we're getting their feedback. So nobody's left out of the loop. If that suggestion comes up in this debate, that's just not true. We have been talking to them. They have our cell numbers. We met with them as recently as 2 weeks ago, and I know Lindsey has been in touch with them earlier this week. So we are engaged and we are listening. But this is a big deal. And we're grateful for all of you to help us get to this point. And Montgomery can really show the way. So this is about buildings and the usage and trying to be more efficient and to bring that usage down. A lot of you worked with us on community choice energy, helping that authorization to get through the General Assembly. And that's to make sure that the sources of energy can be more clean. And that's, again, really groundbreaking for a county of our size. So those two policies, if we're successful getting them underway, will really begin to make a difference in reducing our GHGs. Why is it? We all know that the 2035 goal, but for Montgomery, it needs to be fast as possible, because Montgomery can do all this stuff, but if we don't show success doing it and doing it soon, then other counties are going to be reticent to pass policies like this. We know that we can bring Montgomery's down to zero, but that's not going to make an impact on climate globally unless other governments do the same thing. So we've got to get out there. We've got to get going. As you can tell from our presentation tonight and from all your interactions with the department, we're committed. We've done our homework. We're ready to go. So there's been no bigger. This is the first real battle legislatively. Hopefully it's not a battle, but this is the first real major milestone to making a major difference on climate change, and we need you. So those are my comments. Lots more discussion ahead, but this first hurdle, getting through, getting this out of the committee and in front of the council is a critical first step. Shruti, I'm so grateful to you and Walter, my friend, and all the other folks who are listening. We've worked with you for a long time. We really appreciate your support and your engagement and all the groups and all the conversations, all the emails, everything. And we look forward to continuing this conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Adam. And we appreciate your leadership at the DEP and everybody who's been working so hard on this from your team. I would like to go back and just make a couple of comments. We started off by saying this when Lindsey started her presentation, but we've had some guests join, and during our presentation. So I want to remind everybody that Montgomery County declared a climate emergency in 2017 and resolved to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2027 and by 100% by 2035, but as yet have enacted only modest legislation to work towards achieving that goal. Policy is a crucial instrument in helping us to drive private markets to prioritize reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And buildings constitute 50% of Montgomery County's greenhouse gas emissions, of which 26% are from commercial, office, and multifamily residential buildings. So the building energy performance standards in conjunction with benchmarking are a foundational tool for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. And to reach the county's climate goals, greenhouse gas emission reduction must be obtained from existing buildings. So we are really, this is an important legislation. I would like to remind everybody again, please email the T&E committee members and tell them to support the BEPS legislation, and every email, every call, every message in support of BEPS helps make a difference. Before we wrap up, I want to quickly ask Walter if you would like to add any comments before we wrap up the session.
Well, no, I think it's, again, kudos to the whole team here. It's the more I hear the presentation and the more I think about it, the more impressed I am with the whole concept. There still seem to be, large questions which are unresolved. Why wouldn't every building owner in the whole county just put in a building performance improvement plan and just say, oh, we're going to kick the can down the road and not do anything for the next, 4 years? It saved them a lot of aggravation. But of course, maybe that has to be worked out.
I will say, Walter, if I can chime in on that, the BPIP is not the easy way out. The BPIP is an alternative way to comply. It is still a significant amount of effort to accomplish that, to prove that you are not able to meet the performance standard. It is not an easy way out.
Right. And again, the question always is going to come down to the financial bottom line. It's interesting to think that all these energy improvements are in some ways an investment that has a payback. And so that a building owner invests $1 million in making the improvements, and how long it's going to take them to have $1 million in savings in their energy costs. And is that going to be a critical calculation? If someone says, well, in my building, I'm going to recoup that in 5 years, that's great, I'm happy to do it. Another person said, no, it's going to take me 25 years to save that $1 million, and it's just not, worth it to my pocketbook. So how are we going to balance the financial aspects of this whole thing with our need to reduce the greenhouse gases?
That's a good question.
I also, before we wrap up, and we have 3 more minutes, but there is a question in the Q&A that we skipped. It is from Debbie. What studies has DEP conducted or reviewed to assess the synchronization of the period over which financing loans need to be repaid and the period over which building owners can either recoup their investment through reduced utilities, ease of rental or rental prices, or pass through those costs to tenants?
So it's a very complex question, but I will say that every building is different. There's almost no way to do that type of analysis on a building by building basis. We have done some technical analysis and some modeling work with the Stephen Winter Associates. That's the technical report that will inform regulations, that'll inform what standards are set for each building type, what's theoretically possible, what's actually possible, what's an aggressive target, what's a lenient target. All that work is currently being done, and awaiting thorough review from us. It's a hefty research document. But I'm not sure that that type of analysis on financing, aligning with payback periods on different projects, that can't be done on a building by building basis by the county, but we want to make sure that we have the tools and the resources available to building owners such that they can get that information more easily. I'll also say that the utility incentives change every 3 years, but we have state grants that are offered every year through the Maryland Energy Administration. We have tax credits in the county. We have the Green Bank that can finance anything that isn't incentivized already. There are a significant number of programs, and when you consider the eligibility of all those programs, trying to figure out aligning payback periods with all that can be quite challenging, but we want to make sure that we give building owners the tools that they can do it for their unique building situation.
Thank you, Lindsey. So we will wrap up today's session. Thank you so much, Adam and all Lindsey and all the TEP team members, Emily, Stan. We really appreciate you taking the time to share this information with us and to give us more insights. And Walter, thank you for joining us to moderate this session. Gary, thanks again from the Sierra Club team, and to everybody who joined us. Together, we can make sure that we are advocating to move this legislation forward. And in the chat, I have put the contacts for the Sierra Club. My email is there, Yvonne's email is there. Feel free to reach out to us and visit our website, Sierra Club/Maryland/Montgomery County. And please feel free to reach out to us with any comments and questions that you may have. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.